Hello and welcome to From Pathology to Resilience, towards strength-based mental health for American Indian, Alaska Native men and boys. My name is Susan Gay and I'll be your moderator for this session. And my Zoom engineer is Alexis. And we would just like to go over a few housekeeping items with you before we get started and turn it over to our presenter for today. First, stay muted unless you want to ask a question, and questions will be entertained at the end of the presentation. Also, you may use the Hoover feature, the Q&A section, to post any questions that you have for our presenter. We want to also encourage you to rate the session by giving us feedback, filling out the evaluation. There's a button under the viewing screen on the Hoover app, and you will just click where it says rate session, and that'll take you to a few questions. Very, very quick and easy to fill out. And you will be also entered into a drawing for a $25 gift card if you fill out the session evaluation. Again, use that feature, or you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom, whichever, but we encourage you mostly to use the Hoover Q&A section. I want to, before I turn it over to our presenter, I want to introduce him and give you a bit of information, a little bit of background on Mr. Nathan Billy. Nathan Billy serves as Director of Behavioral Health Programs for the National Indian Health Board. He is a tribal member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and has previously served his nation as both a licensed professional counselor and Deputy Director of Behavioral Health. His therapeutic and administrative experience includes a specific focus on substance use disorders, opioid prevention, treatment and recovery initiatives, suicide prevention, screening and assessment, and integrating behavioral health care in both clinical and tribal law enforcement settings. He is currently completing his PhD dissertation, which focuses on Choctaw cultural identity as a source of strength and resilience in recovery from substance use disorders. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Nathan Billy, our presenter for today for this session, From Pathology to Resilience towards Strength-Based Mental Health for American Indian, Alaska Native men and boys. Mr. Billy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. I really appreciate you, and thank you for that introduction. Thank you for everyone for the gift of your time today and joining us for this presentation that if I could have created a longer title for, I don't know that I could. This is a mouthful with a lot of consonants in there for me to stumble over. So I'm glad that you said it a couple of times and we can just look at it just instead of speaking it over and over. But I do want to acknowledge I'm coming to you at this virtual conference from the Washington, D.C. metro area, which I would like to acknowledge are the ancestral homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway peoples. So thank you and respectfully acknowledge their traditional homelands. Yeah, so just looking together, I thought, I know we have a relatively brief time to get through everything. So the slides themselves are actually short. There's only 8 or 9 of them, and but we'll pace ourselves into getting to that. I hope that you have questions that come up as we move through each of them. The goal is to actually just do the entire presentation without stopping necessarily for questions along the way, if that works for everyone, or if that seems fairly organic. And then toward the end, we'll have some time for discussion and some open things. So please do, would encourage you, please do put any questions that you have, comments, anything you would like to add to the chat. And later we will have absolutely make some time to discuss anything like that, or anything that's on your mind, or some feedback. So just kind of moving forward, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pull this up real quickly. Make sure. And Susan, does that look okay? Everything coming across all right?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So in terms of what I hope at least to get out of this and what I've designed this for our learning objectives, when we talk about moving from pathology to resilience, we want to, of course, look at those factors that have contributed to the development of American Indian and Alaska Native identity of men and boys as pathology. That sort of, why do we see this situation where there's pathology or liability for having American Indian or Alaska Native identity among men and boys? And then as we look at moving toward resilience, I think it's important that we actually look at what Native resilience is and what it is not. And then when we establish that and kind of explore that a bit together, we can look at some of the implications for what does that mean for the mental health and well-being then of our AIAN men and boys, and how might we implement some strengths-based approaches. And I want to be clear right from the start that we're going to center everything in this particular discussion around AIAN cultural reclamation and revitalization. So for those of you who have experience with strengths-based approaches to mental health, we know that that's a very wide field, and there's a lot of research, a lot of literature available on how to capitalize on strengths in terms of inherent personality traits, certain characteristics. Those we will touch on slightly, but when we're looking at strengths-based approaches for this particular presentation, we're talking especially about culture, about Native cultural reclamation, and culture as primary prevention, culture as treatment, culture as recovery, and finding strength within tribal identity and the rediscovery of that identity. So just want to be clear from the get-go, there is a time and place to discover all the other aspects of strength-based approaches, but this will be centered in cultural identity, especially as we're trying to correct that identity of pathology or liability. So with your permission, we could just move forward and start. As we look at the American Indian Alaska Native men and boys as pathology, it's an interesting predicament that I think we find ourselves in when it comes to how did we get there? And in these contributing factors, I thought it would be especially important to look at data and sort of the paradox of data, the problems with data, when on the one hand, we want to show the data that proves inequity, health disparity, and those data sets are there. The catch-22 is that even as we show disparity data and inequity data, in the wrong hands, or if it's interpreted what I would call irresponsibly, analyzed irresponsibly, that quantitative data tells such a partial story. And again, if it's irresponsibly analyzed through a lens of prejudice in particular, that data can actually be used against us. It can be used against Native identity. Just as an example, there is some compelling truth, some stark facts. If we look at the data that has come from 2020 in particular, so we're looking at right in the middle of dealing with the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. 2021 data is coming out. It's becoming more available. It's just not quite as compiled yet in a way that we can analyze it well. But in 2020, we see from the CDC that American Indians and Alaska Natives had the highest age-adjusted drug overdose death rate of any demographic population that is identified. We also had the highest age-adjusted suicide rate of any population demographic. Suicide was the leading cause of death for American Indians and Alaska Natives from the ages of 10 to 24. That's just startling to think, the leading cause of death for AIANs 10 to 24. And even when we look at AIANs 45 and older, it was the fourth leading cause of death, suicide was. And the only thing that eclipsed that was COVID-19 or age-related illness. And so when we're faced with demographics or demographical data like that, and we see highest suicide rate, highest substance use disorder rate, highest drug overdose death rates, and then we dig a little deeper and realize, well, what are these substances? And we see how the opioid epidemic is impacting Indian country, especially recently with fentanyl. When we look at how alcohol use disorder and methamphetamines in particular continue to ravage across Indian country, it's very easy to see in the wrong hands, those high rates can be used against us to establish, well, that is a liability. There's something about being Native and the predispositions that you seemingly have as being Native that means we're courting trouble or courting disaster. And that has happened to us, unfortunately, where those quantitative data sets, when they're not put in context, can be used against us. And I invite us all, if we'll hold on to that just a moment, because we're going to shift that into something much better in just a moment when we contextualize it. But just to be aware that that is certainly happening. So sometimes when we, for example, at the National Indian Health Board, as we advocate for funding and we are talking about these health disparities, there is that risk of, you know, that outward question of what is actually happening here that we'll look at here in a moment. We also see that Native stereotyping and dehumanizing contributes to this identity of pathology, that this identity of a liability. And it's interestingly from two sides. One is those that are overtly negative. For example, sports mascots, where Native imagery or sacred Native regalia are used as costumes, or they're used as dress-up factors. And at NIHB, we recently sent a letter to the Atlanta Braves talking about this, about how this flippant use of Native imagery and Native language of practices that are translated into nothing more than sports custom has a detrimental effect. And there was a study in 2020 that came out showing a direct link between, or at least a high correlation between this type of sports mascots and lowered self-esteem and lowered self-worth among American Indians and Alaskan Natives. There was also a study with Native youth showing that negative media portrayals actually impacted how willing they were to believe they were capable of achieving certain educational and career outcomes. They might not even try for certain degrees, might not even try to get into certain colleges or attempt certain career paths because they felt like that's just not for someone like me. Because this dehumanizing that goes on in the negative stereotyping. And then, of course, we've seen what I will call the overcorrection, which is when sometimes people try, but don't do, maybe it was well-meaning, I don't know the motives necessarily, but we see things like Disney's Pocahontas, for example, which turned Pocahontas into a princess, and there's this beautiful song that was featured and everything. And when we really look at that, the Powhatan woman, Matuaka, who was captured by the English and taken to England away from her ancestral homelands and died before the age of 21 in England, away from her homeland. That's not as beautiful of a Disney story as seeing her paint with all the colors of the wind, you know. And so sometimes even in an effort to portray something positively, let's have this beautiful Disney heroine, let's show her as a princess, so to speak. That was not the truth. That was not the story. Or we always, having the quotes there on the slide, you know, the wise old Indian, where we see that he speaks in stilted English and you consult him at a mountaintop and he speaks wisdom, and it looks like a positive portrayal, but it isn't. It's such a surface stereotyping, and it still fails to take American Indian, Alaska Native identity authentically or genuinely. And of course, worse, it's portrayed by non-natives. That doesn't necessarily, I don't mean that hypercritically, that it is impossible for non-natives to portray natives positively. Only that when natives do not own their own storytelling, there is the potential that it could be very misled in some of that representation. So when you combine that data issue with what we see in native stereotyping, some of that dehumanizing, if you want to kind of see as the icing on the cake or the foundational issue of this, when we look primarily at the colonialist or Western-based paradigms that we have inherited, let's just take the allopathic medicine model, which is, of course, very desirable in many ways and serves a really great purpose. I mean, I love antibiotics and I need them at times. They serve their purpose. But when we see these data sets that look at substance use disorders and suicide rates, it's very easy to turn Native identity into a problem to be solved. That there is something about being Native that means you are born a problem, you are predisposed to problems, you will likely become a problem, and we have to fix you. And we need to fix you with these allopathic medicines. We need to throw medication at you and put you in a controlled trial and see if there's any hope at rescuing you from these predispositions that you have just by being born. What's even worse is when some of these disorders like substance use disorders have led to legal troubles, perhaps possession or distribution of illegal substances, which results in criminal prosecution. The goal is punitive justice from that Western model. Let's find out who's dealing. Let's find out who's possessing, and let's punish them. Let's make sure they get their due, walk them away, keep them away from the innocent people. And again, all of that plays in together. We've already dehumanized natives. We've already got the data to show the problem. So now let's lock them up so that they can't affect all of the innocent people. And I know that sounds like a very stark picture, but it is what we have experienced. And it is so much of to the detriment that these Western models have really worked against us many times when all of this is combined. And I put the verses in there because Native medicine and restorative justice, which we'll look at in just a moment, are very different. And so allowing the Native lens to flourish is what we will look at here shortly. I'd like to look at this question, and it's a hurtful question. It is a hurtful question that was posed to me by someone who is external outside of Native communities. And when it's a friend, a trustworthy friend, but when he first posed this to me, I wasn't really offended exactly, but I was a bit shocked. And then I understood why he was asking it. And I do a lot of work at the National Indian Health Board, focusing on resilience and focusing on strengths and focusing on Native culture and reclamation. So when we presented this data about our recent suicide rates and our substance use disorder rates within our communities, he said, if you're so strong and you're so resilient, why are you leading in all this bad stuff? He was having trouble making that connection between, I hear you say you're strong. I hear you say your tribes are so resilient, but your suicide rates are the highest. Your substance use disorder rates are the highest. He's like, help me understand this. And so again, offended is not really the word that I would use to describe my response. I was just taken aback at first until I thought, when you're not within the community and when you do not have a grounding or an understanding in Native history, that question, it may be stark, but it's fair in one sense. It's a fair question for someone who doesn't understand to go, I'm having trouble making these two things fit together. How do I make the message that you're saying, and how do I reconcile that with the data that we're also reporting? So this is where I would like to invite us together to explore what I call the 2 E's, which is the first word, excuses. We do not look for ways to excuse behaviors. Nothing that we are looking at together is an effort to say there is an excuse for what we might call negative behaviors, or we're not trying to excuse, especially anything that might lead to violent or criminal behaviors. We do, however, look for the other important E word, which is an explanation. Explanations are not excuses. And in fact, explanations, when they're contextualized, really, to me, open up the doorway for progress. They open up the doorway for us to do something about it. So we're not trying to excuse, but we are trying to explain. So if you're willing to go on that journey with me, let's just explain in the time that we have left, look at some of those explanations together. So I'd like to look at what I call the paradox of resilience. Since the title is From Pathology to Resilience, we need to know exactly, well, what are we moving to? When we talk about resilience in Native communities, to my friend's question, if you're so resilient, let's take some opportunity to define that together. So this is what, for me, I like to situate every time I talk about resilience as the burden of resilience, the Native burden of resilience. With that line that you can see just right there on the slide, we are resilient because we must be. We have to be. There is no choice. And I think it is important when we talk about Native resilience, it is not standard, normal resilience that all human beings experience when we think, I'm just going to find the grit within myself to keep going. There's a good trait, a personality trait. We hear a lot about grit, and we talk a lot about that drive to find the strength to go on and to keep moving forward. But I'm not talking about the normal things in life that we all experience, it's good to find that resilience within ourselves to keep powering through. We're talking about systems that were created to destroy Native peoples. When we look at the history of colonialism in the United States of America, The Native experience is one of both physical genocide and cultural genocide, and those are realities. There were dedicated programmatic efforts to murder Natives. After a time, it seems that switched to what we might call cultural genocide. If Natives are allowed to live, they will be relocated, they will be removed from their traditional homelands, they will be pushed ever westward under expansion. And as that expansion happens, we saw things like the Native residential boarding school programs, programmatic efforts on the part of federal agencies to completely eradicate Native identity, taking away language, taking away custom, cutting our hair, forcing us to dress certain ways, and literally removing us from our families, from our communities through these very specific programs with very specific curricula that were designed to make us different people than we entered. That is not a normal experience. That's a programmatic systemic system of genocide. And when we root our experience there, we can see that the resilience that we have had to display is a result of inequitable and dangerous systems. So Native resilience is a very specific resilience. It is one where, and I have what it is not. We're not talking about bearing our emotions and just powering through. This is not rugged American individualism, where we, take that classic inherited American sense of I'm just going to be myself and I'm going to do whatever I can do and I'm going to accomplish it because I'm amazing, and I'm strong. That is not Native resilience. Authentic Native resilience, as we have seen, it is community-based. Yes, it is individual, but it is the individual within their tribal community. And tribal disconnection from community has led to so much trauma, as we have seen Native people separated from the communities of support that they had. Native resilience is culture-centered, not culture as an addition. And we'll talk about that if we have time here in just a moment too. This isn't about adding culture as a supplement to who we are. This is about centering culture as our resilience. But most importantly, it is justice seeking. It is a shame, I believe, to keep telling Native people, keep being resilient, just keep being strong. Have you ever yourself just sat back and thought, I love these resilience messages, but if anyone tells me to be resilient one more time, I'm going to lose it because I'm tired. I'm tired. Isn't it okay once in a while to go, I don't feel strong. I don't feel it. I feel weak. I feel hurt. Well, it's not just about feeling for Native populations. We have experienced systems of prejudice, systems of, again, cultural genocide. When you experience that type of systemic attack, then the resilience that is born from that is a burden that you carry with you. So when we talk about justice seeking, the work we do at NIHB, the work we partner with multiple other tribal organizations, it is to say there are systems that were designed to hurt us, and it is time for those systems to change. We do not deserve to carry the burden of resilience. And so when we move from pathology to resilience, we're talking about moving from one identity that was forced upon us to an identity that is truly authentic, that is us. We are resilient because our culture is strength, and it's time to get that back. And it's time to reclaim that and know who we really are. And that is where we have, it opens up to me the opportunities for messages for men and boys to seize upon when it comes to our culture. And I know we're moving down towards some time factors, so I'll try to move through this quickly. I do think it's important to note, for those of us who are wanting to do that, let's go on this journey together. We do have to frame mental health and substance use disorders in the traditional paradigm. That it's not that we're saying to get completely away from it. There are benefits, and I've listed some of those that we're all very well aware of. If you want to code, bill, and reimburse, frankly, you have to have a traditional Western diagnosis. It has to have a number associated with it, and you have to submit it by a licensed professional, or else the reimbursement money is not there. So that's just a reality. There are some other benefits, though, to having a traditional diagnosis that could be used against you ultimately, but there's a lot of peer-reviewed literature around diagnoses. Diagnoses creates a consensus where we can address it. We can look at evidence-based protocols. We can say, Around this diagnosis, there are specific symptoms. Let's attempt to treat them. And then let's test to see if those treatments worked. We'll evaluate them. What worked, we'll continue, we'll expand, or we'll kick out what doesn't. So there are benefits to the traditional diagnostic paradigms. But the challenges, of course, within Native communities is that diagnosis can quickly become a stigma if those diagnoses are internalized as identity. I'd like to give you an example real quickly from something that is evidence-based protocol for substance use disorder recovery, and that would be peer recovery support groups. And I do not mean to be hypercritical. I just want to use this as an example. AA and NA, for example, have worked for many people. So again, I don't mean to be critical of those paradigms. But imagine that you are a Native person who speaks power within your language to word, especially connected to your name. And in this evidence-based peer recovery group, you show up, and it is anonymous, but you speak your name. So what do you do as you move around the table? You hear yourself speak your name, the power of your name. And the very next statement is, and I am an addict. I am an alcoholic. This is my name, and this is who I am. And in 2 short sentences, we have become our diagnosis. We have become our pathology. And my name, the power of my name, has been linked to the noun of addiction. I am Nathan, I am an addict. There are ways to think beyond that, to think of how this might be interpreted or internalized by someone who is seeking to recover, and it may not be working the way we hope that it would work. So even evidence-based peer recovery is not necessarily compatible with AIAN specific culture. And that is something we need to be very aware of, is what's being communicated. And as again, we move quickly. So what are these strength-based approaches? The strength-based approaches that are specific to culture see culture as primary prevention and primary strength. I think it's important that we establish immediately. I personally have no interest in seeing Native interventions labeled alternative. Like we have here your standard interventions, and then you can also tie it up in a cultural bow, or you can culturally tailor it, or you can make it culturally acceptable. Culture is primary, not alternative. And so one of the things that we advocate for in a strengths-based approach for Natives is your culture is your strength. It is not an addition. While we say that, we also recognize that programs like boarding schools, programs just experiencing our historical and intergenerational trauma, has separated many of us from that culture. It has separated many of us from those communities. So many of us are exploring what that even means. What is our identity? We're rediscovering it. We're reclaiming it because we were separated from it. Some of us lost our language. We lost the ability to speak. And so we also have to respect in these strengths-based to go at the pace of the men and boys who are in a predicament where they are finding their culture again. They're rediscovering their identity. So part of that support is exploring who you are becoming, and exploring your rediscovery of your authentic self. We can do that by increasing and supporting programs that help them reconnect to their language, to their food, traditional arts practices, mentoring them, especially youth, Native boys, mentoring them with elders who have a closer connection or more of a connection to language, or can give them wisdom, tribal wisdom, connecting them to that authentic American Indian, Alaskan Native representation, that culturally specific peer recovery that I talked about, where we encourage cultural specific programs, respect for restorative justice, instead of that punitive paradigm where you did A, B, and C, now let's punish you. It's how can you as a tribal member be healed? There are tribes that have communal healing programs that say, yes, you have perpetrated an act. However, what is the reasoning and how can we restore you to wellness so that you do not do that anymore organically? No one forced you, no one locked you up. That's not the point. You have changed from the inside out. We are healing you so that you do acts of wellness. As we do this, by the way, I think I'll wrap this up. Do I have one more minute? I can 1 more minute to wrap up. Is that all right? Okay.
You have 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought I was, okay. Thank you so much. wasn't able to toggle over to that chat. I appreciate that, Susan. Thank you. When we think about how to do that, I think a great example that I've seen some tribes use about what does it mean strengths-based reconnection. Let's take domestic violence prevention or healing in that area of mental health and mental wellness, intimate partner violence prevention. There is tribal messaging that we can give to men and boys specifically that tell them the truth, which is that colonialism and Western-based paradigms are actually primarily responsible for the objectification and subjugation of women as objects to be used. That is not Native. That is not traditionally American Indian and Alaska Native. That is not authentically Native. When we look back to authentic Native practice, we primarily see profound respect for women. We see women in leadership. We see matriarchal societies. And to be sure, American Indian Alaskan Native experience is diverse. So I don't mean in any way to put this together as if it's one central way of living. But in general, across the board, respect and care for women is Native. So we are suggesting unapologetically that as you reconnect more to your culture authentically as a man, as a boy, you will protect women. You will respect women. You will respect the leadership of women. When women are in a position of authority over you, it is not a threat. It is not something to rebel against. That is not your culture. Your culture accepts, encourages, and respects that. It is only when, again, foreign Western practices came into your culture and encouraged you to subjugate or objectify the women around you that these problems intensified. I'm not trying to present a utopia or a picture of pre-colonial utopia that everything was perfect and there were no problems or that murders did not occur in Native tribes. That is not at all what I mean. Humans are still humans, the human predicament. But culturally, that is not something that we supported, that Native culture supported. So cultural connection has very practical, specific protective factors in it, not just for the person, but for how they behave toward the people around them within their community and how they see entire groups, so to speak, of people. So what does it require of us? I will say cultural humility first and cultural competence second. Those of us who aren't as familiar, if you haven't had an opportunity to explore this, I would encourage you to, because it's just some great literature out there about this. Cultural competence is important, but it's also very difficult. There are 574 federally recognized tribes. That does not count state recognized tribes. That does not count people who identify as American Indian and Alaska Native who are not a part of a recognized tribe, but they still have the identity. So to try to become culturally competent in hundreds of tribal ways is next to impossible. So rather than putting the burden on ourselves to think I have to be competent in everything, cultural humility first. Be humble to recognize bias, be open to where the person is in their identity and encourage them to explore the connection of that identity, even if I don't necessarily understand, and open myself to self-correction if necessary as I am helping to serve a tribal member or an American Indian, Alaskan Native. The willingness to move beyond traditional medical models, that is a challenge because most of us to become licensed, we're trained in them, to be frank. We implement evidence-based practices. So this is not an anti-evidence-based practice presentation. There is space for that. There are reasons they are there. We implement them, we use them, we culturally tailor them when we need to. But there is a willingness, at least, that we have to move beyond those traditional medical models to traditional Native models of care, to respect where those journeys are. And this last thing, to support Indigenous research, Indigenous knowledge production, practice-based evidence, Indigenous evaluation. There's Native medicine that cannot and should not be subjected to Western evaluation methods. Is this working? Let's take a Native practice and do a randomized controlled trial on it and see if a control group receives this. That's nonsensical. That is not how sacred Native medicine works. So to subject it to a Western evaluation method is both insensitive and really, it's just nonsensical. So we have practice-based evidence within Native culture that shows that Native medicine works. Again, not as an alternative, but as central. So to advocate that when someone wants a Native or a tribally specific treatment, It is not an addition to their treatment. It is foundational to their treatment. It is foundational to their recovery. And it should be and can be foundational to our prevention efforts as well. So again, I know we moved that very quickly. I apologize, especially when I get excited, I tend to talk very quickly. And so if I talk really fast, I'm used to telling people if I'm going too fast, I'm not offended at all by going, Nate, just stop, just slow it down. So if I went too fast, we're at the questions, comments, and concerns part of that. I appreciate your time, and we'll turn that over, Susan, to anything we might want to. I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Billy. That was excellent insight. I like how you approach from pathology to resilience and really try to figure out what that means. So thank you very much for sharing your time and your expertise with us on this very important topic. I haven't noticed any questions come in, but I do have a few of my own. And my first question would be, how do strength-based approaches to mental health services differ from other approaches? So in other words, what would be opposite of a strength-based approach?
I think in a sense, how it primarily differs just in general is that when we look at the traditional approach, what we're primarily looking at, like for those of us who might be in mental health or might be looking at a diagnostic process, we have all of this literature that is produced. Here are the things that are necessary to come up with a diagnosis. And so as we look at that diagnosis, what we will do is see all of the problems that we need to treat from external pathways. So what external thing are we going to use on this problem? And it's the best way to put it is, or the best way I can think of to put it anyway, and if anyone can offer something more, please do. It's more of a negative, treating from the negative to begin with. We look at what is wrong. Here are the problems, here are the symptoms. Let's treat the symptoms. Let's try to make the symptoms better. Maybe we treat the root cause, of course, but we're looking at symptoms and how we can decrease those pathologies. Whereas strengths-based is looking at what is true about myself, what is true about my community or my support structure, what is true about my personality that can be used to overcome, that I am identifying what is strong already and in a sense capitalizing on that, expanding on that as a means to recover or as a means to prevent, rather than seeing myself as a problem to be solved. Is that?
Thank you. That makes perfect sense. I have two comments in the chat that I'd like to share with you. Jordan says, love this presentation. Thank you for sharing this valuable and important information. Another Jordan says, this is an amazing presentation to shed light on how we as Native people are living today compared to how we used to live and act. To be respectful, I'm not going to try to pronounce the word in the Native language, so it just says thank you at the end. So those were two comments that came in for this presentation. I also have another question. If no one else, again, if you have questions, please feel free to post them in the Hoover Q&A section. We have about 7 minutes left. So we want to give you the opportunity to ask questions of Mr. Billy. Another question I have, what are some mental health protective factors that can help American Indian and Alaska Native males reclaim and revitalize their identity? So again, protective factors to help AIAN males.
I think that's an excellent question. And one of the things that I am most excited about right now in terms of the literature are the various groups that are reclaiming Indigenous knowledge and are exploring the answer to that question. They're looking at specific protective factors as because we're really experiencing this in real time, if we want to think about it that way. This isn't a lot of behind, like where we have experience behind us. We're in the middle of determining for ourselves what this means. I think the challenge has been, we've always said culture is prevention, culture is our strength. And the challenge has been to identify exactly the answer to your question. What do we mean specifically when we say that? So just as an example, there has been some significant, again, correlations that the more Native youth, if we think of boys that are able to have a sense of belonging or identity to Native specific groups, in the Choctaw Nation, for example, we saw stickball, Choctaw stickball. As we encourage stickball leagues and youth to participate in, learn about the history of stickball, learn their place in it, learn how they are a part, what it really means, and to encourage them to be a part of that, even if they feel that they're not particularly very good at it, or if you want to kind of avoid the ambulance that's always waiting, because it can get pretty fierce on the stickball field. But that sense of belonging, there is evidence that being a part of communal groups like that within our Native communities connected to a specific Native cultural practice makes youth less likely to try substances for the first time, to self-medicate, or to look at substances as self-medicating through trauma. That part of working through that trauma is that belonging to begin with. The more we establish belonging, it seems to at least have a direct impact, especially in the areas of substance use or willingness to try substance use or engage in certain risky behaviors, especially at a younger age. Okay. And so that would just be one example of a protective factor accomplished by something very specifically cultural, especially the sense of belonging.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I did have a question pop in, so I'm going to go ahead and share that. How would you recommend someone approaching an AIAN male to seek necessary health care? I know I have a hard time convincing my male relatives to seek preventative care, and they tend to wait until the last minute when health issues get worse. So how would you recommend someone approaching an AIAN male to seek necessary health care?
That's an excellent question. And I want to be careful not to provide too comprehensive of an answer, because it is so specific, and the experiences can differ regionally, even as we find, across in terms of attitudes. But just for some helpful information, I think part of it is recognizing a little of what we were able to kind of talk about together earlier, which is to recognize that much of, I would say, the mindset that has been inherited as a result of this sort of Western expansion and the colonialist paradigms has been that adoption of the identity of a pathology. And so you may be talking to someone, or you may be trying to help someone who, every time that help is offered, it sounds as if they are a problem to be solved, or they're thinking of themselves as here we go again. I'm fine. And the way to show that I am strong, and the way to show that I am resilient, is to power through that really non-native, non-authentically native aspect that has kind of been pulled over to us, that for somehow there's weakness associated, because we see those things as weaknesses, or as problems to be solved. I wish we had more time to explore, and maybe in another time we could look into this somehow, which is those specific strength-based ways we can encourage, maybe not overtly. I think instead of saying, for example, you clearly have problem A, and here are the issues that you have with it, and this is how you need to get it treated, let me help you. The more we encourage self-empowered leadership toward it, if that makes any sense, sort of an encouragement for, I'm not suggesting we be manipulative, but if there's a way to talk openly with someone where they are in the driver's seat, and it's very clear that they're not being dragged along, but they're being encouraged. Models help a lot. What I have found the most, when someone else has been a successful model or representation of that, if I could speak just in just a few seconds, watching, for example, Sterling Harjo's FX Hulu series, Reservation Dogs, which has been just pivotal in showing Native representation on the screen. I know not everyone is on board with every single aspect of it, but to me, it's very powerful in showing protective factors within Native communities, and how it can tackle some very heavy subjects, especially suicide and substance use, in a way that shows what those protective factors look like in action and what works more organically, and how communities come together, and how some of that opening up comes when there is that safety established in the communal support.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you again for this excellent presentation. I know based on the comments that our attendees have benefited from it. And as you said, hopefully next year when we hopefully are in person again, we will be able to invite you back to do a session in person and probably have more time at that time. So thank you to our attendees. And I want to remind you to rate the session by going to your Whova app and clicking the rate the session button. So thank you very much again, Mr. Billy, and thank you attendees. We will end here now.